The city lights below glowed faintly through the haze of rain, their reflection streaking the glass wall of my office. I sat there, slouched in my leather chair, staring at the bottom of an empty tumbler. The whiskey had done nothing to dull the edge slicing through my thoughts. It wasn't the rain or the hour, or even the numbers I'd been staring at for the past 2 hours that had me stuck in that chair. It was the thought of Daniel. Daniel Price, my CFO, my closest friend, the man I'd trusted with every secret, every critical decision, every goddamn thing I thought I'd built. A man I'd brought into my company when we were both green and hungry, still cutting our teeth in an industry that didn't forgive mistakes. And it wasn't just him. No, that would have been easier. Betrayal by itself is clean, like a blade to the chest. But this? This was worse. This was rot. A slow infection spreading through the foundation of my life, until everything I thought was solid was soft and decayed. I swirled the glass absently, watching the last amber drops slide along the sides. The numbers Naomi Lawson had given me were burned into my brain. 8 years. Millions siphoned into offshore accounts. Carefully disguised, routed through shell companies, hidden behind layers of transactions that had taken her weeks to untangle. But the numbers weren't what made my gut twist. It was the emails. Late-night meeting confirmations. Text logs of conversations that weren't about business. And then the photos. Grainy security footage of Daniel and my wife Maggie, stepping out of an elevator together at the W Hotel. Her smile was radiant, her laugh frozen mid-frame, her hand brushing his arm in that way she used to touch mine, back when she still saw me. I slammed the glass onto the desk, and it cracked, a spiderweb spreading from the point of impact. The whiskey splashed across the mahogany, glinting like molten gold under the low light. For a moment, I just stared at it, my chest heaving. I'd thought I was smart. Careful. I'd built this company from nothing. I'd outmaneuvered competitors twice my size, navigated lawsuits, crises, and hostile takeovers. But I hadn't seen this. I hadn't seen my own goddamn life coming apart while I was too busy sitting in this office, building an empire. Mr. Kane. Her voice startled me. Naomi stood hesitantly in the doorway, clutching a file to her chest. She was young, mid-20s maybe, meticulous to a fault, with the kind of quiet diligence that had earned her the role of lead accountant. She looked like she wanted to be anywhere else. What is it? My voice came out harder than I intended, and she flinched. I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed for the board meeting tomorrow. I waved at the stack of reports on the corner of my desk. It's fine. I've got it. She didn't leave. Her hand tightened on the file, her knuckles whitening. Naomi, I said, softer this time. What is it? Her eyes darted to the cracked glass, then to the whiskey pooling on the desk, before settling on the floor. I'm sorry, she stammered. For bringing this to you. I just thought. You thought right, I said, cutting her off. You did your job. I'm glad you told me. She nodded, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction. Do you want me to follow up on anything? I shook my head. No. This is mine now. Go home. Naomi hesitated for a beat, then disappeared down the hall, leaving me alone with the shattered glass and the sharp, bitter ache in my chest. Maggie was still awake when I got home. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt practiced, deliberate. She was in the living room, curled on the couch with a glass of wine in her hand and her phone in the other. The firelight flickered across her face, softening her features, making her look almost innocent. Working late? She asked, not looking up. Something like that. My voice was even, steady. The storm was still inside me, but I was holding it back, waiting for the right moment. I hung my coat by the door and crossed the room, taking the armchair opposite her. She glanced at me then, just a quick flick of her eyes. Her smile was faint, polite. The kind of smile you give a stranger at the grocery store. How was your day? I asked. Fine. Long. Grace has a math test tomorrow, and Caleb's still sulking about losing his game last weekend. She sipped her wine and turned back to her phone, the conversation already over in her mind. Where were you last Thursday night? The words came out like a bullet, fast and unplanned. They hung in the air between us, a challenge neither of us could ignore. Her hand froze halfway to her glass. For a second, her expression didn't change, and I wondered if she'd even heard me. Then she set the glass down carefully, deliberately, and met my eyes. What are you talking about? I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, my fingers clasped tightly together to keep from shaking. I know, Maggie. She blinked, her expression unreadable. Know what? Don't insult me, I snapped. My voice was low but sharp, and it cut through the room like a blade. I've got the emails, the hotel receipts, the security footage. So why don't you drop the act and tell me the truth for once? Her face paled, but she didn't look away. She didn't crumble or cry or beg for forgiveness. Instead, she set her phone down and leaned back, crossing her arms over her chest. What do you want me to say, John? That I'm sorry? That it was a mistake? Would that make you feel better? My jaw clenched so hard I thought my teeth might crack. I want you to tell me why. Why him? Why this? After everything we've built, everything we've been through. Everything we've been through? She interrupted, her voice rising. What exactly have we been through together, John? You mean the last 10 years of you working late, missing dinners, skipping birthdays? You mean the endless hours I've spent alone in this house, waiting for you to remember I exist? I stood abruptly, towering over her, my fists clenched at my sides. Don't you dare turn this around on me. Why not? She shot back, rising to meet me. You want the truth? Fine. The truth is, you gave me everything but yourself. You built your empire, John, but you left me behind. And Daniel? At least he saw me. Her words hit me like a freight train, knocking the air from my lungs. I stared at her, my chest heaving, my mind racing to process what she'd just said. She stepped closer, her voice softer now, almost pitying. You're angry and I get it. But this isn't about him. This is about us. About what we stopped being a long time ago. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. The storm inside me was breaking loose, but I forced myself to speak. You think this is about us? Maggie, you destroyed us. You destroyed me. Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. She held her ground, unflinching. Maybe I did. But you let it happen. The silence between us was thick enough to choke on. I stood there, staring at Maggie, her arms crossed over her chest, her jaw set in defiance. The fire crackled in the background, its glow mocking the coldness between us. I wanted to scream, to break something, to demand answers that I already knew I wouldn't get. But instead, I took a slow, deliberate breath and turned away. If I stayed in that room 1 second longer, I was going to say something I couldn't take back. My shoes echoed against the hardwood as I walked to the kitchen, yanked open the liquor cabinet, and poured myself a double of the first thing I grabbed. The whiskey burned going down, but it didn't touch the fire in my chest. Running away again, John? Maggie's voice carried from the living room, calm and laced with venom. That's what you're best at, isn't it? I froze, the glass halfway to my lips. My hand tightened around it so hard I thought it might shatter. You have no right to say that to me. No right. She appeared in the doorway, her silhouette sharp against the warm light behind her. I'm not the one who's been emotionally checked out for a decade. You think this just happened? You think one day I woke up and decided, you know what? I think I'll blow up my life today? I turned to face her, my knuckles white around the glass. You blew up my life. You blew up our family. And now you're standing there trying to justify it? Do you even hear yourself? She shook her head, laughing bitterly. You don't get it. You've never gotten it. You think this is about sex, about Daniel? It's not. It's about being invisible. Do you know how that feels, John? To be invisible in your own marriage. You're unbelievable. I set the glass down with a sharp clink and took a step closer to her. You've been lying to me. Sleeping with my best friend. Making me look like a goddamn fool. And now you want me to feel sorry for you. Yes, she said, her voice breaking for the first time. Yes, I do. Because I'm not the only one who broke us. You did too, John. You just didn't have the guts to admit it. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But she didn't. Maggie never cried. That was one of the things I'd loved about her once. Her strength, her fire. Now, it just felt like a weapon she was using against me. I don't even know who you are anymore, I said quietly. She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. Maybe you never did. And with that, she turned and walked upstairs, leaving me alone in the kitchen with nothing but the sound of the fire popping in the next room. I didn't follow her. I couldn't. Instead, I poured another drink and sat at the counter, staring at the empty house around me. The house I'd bought for her. For us. For the family we were supposed to build together. Now it felt like a tomb. The clock on the microwave blinked 1:47 a.m. when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, squinting at the screen. Alex Carter. I hesitated for a moment before answering. What is it? Got something for you, Alex said, his voice low and serious. You up? Yeah. I stood, running a hand through my hair. What did you find? Not over the phone. Meet me at my office. I glanced toward the staircase, where the faint glow of a light under the bedroom door told me Maggie was still awake. Give me 20 minutes. Alex's office was in a rundown building on the edge of the city, sandwiched between a pawn shop and a check-cashing place. The neon light from the pawn shop's sign buzzed faintly through the cracked blinds as I stepped inside. Alex was waiting for me, a manila folder in one hand and a half-smoked cigarette in the other. You look like hell, he said by way of greeting. Feel worse? I dropped into the chair across from his desk and gestured at the folder. What VE you got? He slid it across the desk, his eyes sharp as they studied me. It's worse than we thought. I opened the folder, my stomach twisting as I scanned the documents inside. Bank statements, text logs, emails. I recognized Daniel's name immediately, along with several others. Names I didn't know but felt like I should. Offshore accounts. Payments disguised as consulting fees. A network of lies so tangled I could barely make sense of it. But the worst was the surveillance photos. Daniel and Maggie weren't the only ones. There were others. Competitors, suppliers, even someone on my own board. Daniel had been selling me out for years, and Maggie had been right there with him, helping him every step of the way. How long? I asked, my voice tight. Best I can tell? 8 years. Alex stubbed out his cigarette and leaned back in his chair. This wasn't just embezzlement, John. It's espionage. Your wife and your CFO have been handing your secrets to Ethan Grant. The name hit me like a slap to the face. Ethan Grant. My oldest rival. The man who'd been trying to destroy me since the day I started Kane Enterprises. And now, I finally understood how he'd always been one step ahead. Jesus Christ, I muttered, running a hand over my face. How did I miss this? Alex shrugged, lighting another cigarette. You trusted them. That's how. I stared at the photos, my chest tightening with every passing second. Maggie's smile, Daniel's smirk, Ethan's handshake, it was all there in black and white. Proof of everything I hadn't wanted to see. What do? I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Alex exhaled a long stream of smoke and leaned forward, his eyes hard. You destroy them. All of them. When I got home, the house was dark and silent. Maggie's light was off, the door to our bedroom closed. I stood in the entryway for a long moment, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the HVAC. Destroy them. Alex's words echoed in my mind as I climbed the stairs, my footsteps heavy on the hardwood. I stopped outside the bedroom door, my hand hovering over the handle. I could walk away. Pack a bag. Leave her to rot in the mess she'd made. But that wasn't me. I wasn't the guy who turned the other cheek. I wasn't the guy who forgave and forgot. I opened the door. Maggie was asleep, curled on her side, the blanket pulled up to her chin. She looked peaceful, innocent even, like the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. But I knew better now. I walked to the dresser, opened the top drawer, and pulled out the letter opener I'd given her on our 10th anniversary. A sleek silver thing engraved with her initials. It felt cold and heavy in my hand. Destroy them. I didn't sleep that night. The bedroom was suffocating. The kind of stillness that wasn't peaceful but stifling, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. Maggie stirred slightly, her breath soft and even, her face serene in the pale glow from the streetlight outside. How many times had I stared at her like this, admiring the quiet beauty of her? How many nights had I convinced myself that what we had was unshakable? I walked out of the room and closed the door quietly behind me. My hand lingered on the handle for a moment before I let it fall. Destroy them. Alex's words looped in my head, and for once, I didn't fight them. Downstairs, the house felt like a mausoleum. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound as I sat at the kitchen table and spread out Alex's folder. The surveillance photos, the logs of wire transfers, the damning emails, they stared back at me like a sneering jury. I grabbed a legal pad from the counter and began writing names. Daniel Price. Maggie Kane. Ethan Grant. Each name felt like a blade as I scrawled it out in angry, jagged letters. But it wasn't enough to write their names. I needed a plan. I needed precision. My phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with Alex's name. I answered without hesitation. Talk. You said you wanted to know everything, he said, his voice rough but certain. I found more. My stomach tightened. How much more? Enough to make this bigger than you thought. Daniel's network isn't just about you, John. He's been selling secrets from other companies too. Suppliers, smaller firms in your orbit, it's a web, and it all ties back to Ethan. I rubbed my temples, the exhaustion setting in like a second skin. Why the hell didn't I see this? You weren't looking, Alex said flatly. You trusted him. The words stung because they were true. Daniel had been my blind spot for years. I'd brought him into my world, treated him like a brother, and now I was paying the price. What's next? I asked, my voice sharper now. I've got a guy. Tech wizard. Discreet. He can dig into their networks, pull things they thought were gone. But it's gonna cost you. Money's not an issue. I figured, Alex said dryly. I'll set it up. You sure you're ready for this? Once we start, there's no going back. I stared at the names on the legal pad, each one a scar on what was left of my life. I'm sure. The next morning, Maggie was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs. She was standing at the counter, stirring a cup of coffee, her robe tied loosely around her waist. For a moment, she looked almost normal, like the wife I used to know, the woman who laughed at my terrible jokes and kissed me like she meant it. But then she turned, and her expression hardened as soon as she saw me. Morning, she said, her voice clipped. Morning, I replied, grabbing a mug and pouring my own coffee. The tension in the room was unbearable, like a string pulled too tight, ready to snap. I sipped my coffee and leaned against the counter, watching her out of the corner of my eye. I think we need to talk, she said finally, setting her mug down and crossing her arms. About what? I asked, though I already knew. She hesitated, her jaw tightening. About us. About where this is going. Where it's going. I repeated, my voice flat. That's funny, Maggie. I thought you already decided where it was going. Right into Daniel's bed. Her face flushed with anger, but she didn't back down. You don't get to play the victim here, John. You haven't exactly been a saint. What the hell does that mean? I asked, my voice rising. It means you shut me out years ago. You cared more about your company than you ever cared about me or this family. Don't act like I'm the only one who broke our vows. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. You're unbelievable. You're sitting here trying to justify screwing my best friend, and you think I'm the one at fault. Her eyes flashed, and for a moment, I thought she might throw her coffee at me. You don't listen, do you? This isn't about Daniel. It's about you being so wrapped up in your goddamn empire that you didn't even notice I was slipping away. I slammed my mug on the counter, the ceramic cracking under the force. You slipped away because you're a selfish, lying coward. And don't you dare put this on me. She took a step back, her arms falling to her sides. For a moment, she looked almost hurt, but it passed quickly, replaced by the cold mask I was starting to hate. I can't do this anymore. Then don't, I snapped. Pack your shit and get out. Her eyes widened, just for a moment, before narrowing again. Is that what you want? It's what I should have done the moment I saw the footage, I said, my voice like ice. But no, I had to give you the chance to dig yourself deeper. She stood there for a long moment, her jaw tight, her eyes burning into mine. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the kitchen, her footsteps echoing on the stairs. I stared after her, my chest heaving, the rage bubbling just below the surface. Destroy them. The words echoed in my head as I picked up my phone and dialed Alex. When he answered, I didn't bother with pleasantries. Start pulling everything on Ethan Grant, I said. Every connection he has to Daniel, every transaction, every meeting. I want it all. Alex hesitated. You sure about this, John? You're about to go nuclear. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles whitening. I don't care. The city blurred outside the passenger window as Alex's beat-up Ford rumbled down the expressway. The rain was still falling, a steady drumbeat against the roof that matched the tension coiled in my chest. Alex drove with one hand on the wheel, the other nursing a cigarette that left a thin trail of smoke curling toward the cracked window. You've been quiet, he said, breaking the silence. His eyes flicked to me briefly before returning to the road. Not having second thoughts, are you? I shook my head. No. Just thinking. About what? About how many years I wasted trusting the wrong people. Alex snorted, tapping ash into an empty soda can in the cup holder. That's the thing about trust, John. It's a loaded gun. Either you're holding it or someone else is, and they'll point it right back at you when it suits them. His cynicism grated, but I couldn't deny he was right. I'd handed that gun to Daniel and Maggie both, and they'd pulled the trigger without a second thought. We pulled into the gravel parking lot of a run-down office complex on the outskirts of town. The building was a squat, gray rectangle that looked like it hadn't seen a coat of paint since the 90s. A neon sign over the door flickered weakly, the word, Digital Solutions, barely legible in the drizzle. Alex killed the engine and gestured toward the building. This is the guy. Tech wizard, like I said. Just don't ask too many questions about where he learned his trade. I followed him inside, the stale smell of old carpet and burnt coffee hitting me immediately. The office was a mess. Wires snaking across the floor, stacks of outdated monitors shoved into corners, and a desk cluttered with energy drink cans and half-eaten bags of chips. Behind the desk sat a wiry man with shaggy hair and glasses that reflected the glow of his computer screens. He looked up as we entered, his fingers still dancing across the keyboard. Alex, he said, his voice flat. You're late. Traffic, Alex replied, waving it off. This is Kane. He's the client. The man's eyes flicked to me, sharp and assessing. You're the one with the wife problem, right? I bristled at his tone, but Alex stepped in before I could respond. Keep it professional, Dean. Just show him what you've got. Dean rolled his eyes but turned to one of his monitors, tapping a few keys. A series of files appeared on the screen, and he opened one, revealing a detailed map of digital transactions. Lines connected names, accounts, and dates in a web so intricate it made my head spin. This, Dean said, pointing to the screen, is the network your boy Daniel's been running. Offshore accounts, fake consulting firms, kickbacks from Ethan Grant's people. It's clean enough to pass casual scrutiny, but if you know what to look for. He tapped a few more keys, and the screen shifted, highlighting discrepancies in red. Sloppy. Like he thought no one would ever bother to dig this deep. Idiots get cocky, Alex muttered. I stared at the screen, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. How much money are we talking? Dean whistled low. Millions. Enough to buy loyalty from a dozen people in your company, maybe more. Your security team, IT, even some of your mid-level execs. Grant's been buying them up like stocks. My jaw tightened. And Maggie? Dean hesitated, glancing at Alex before answering. She's not as involved in the money side of things, but she's definitely in the loop. Emails, meetings, a few intimate hotel stays. I clenched my fists, the rage coursing through me like a live wire. I want every piece of this, I said, my voice low and steady. Every transaction, every email, every person they've bought. I want names, dates, locations. Dean smirked, leaning back in his chair. That's the easy part. The question is, what are you planning to do with it? I met his gaze, my expression cold. That's my business. Alex clapped a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm. He's serious, Dean. Get it done. Dean shrugged and turned back to his monitors. It'll take a few days to compile everything. I'll send it to you when it's ready. I nodded, already moving toward the door. Alex followed, his boots heavy on the worn carpet. John, Dean called after me. I stopped but didn't turn around. Whatever you're planning, don't half-ass it. People like this? They'll keep coming for you unless you make damn sure they can't. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The fire burning in my chest told me he was right. Back at the house, Maggie was sitting in the living room again, her wine glass on the coffee table next to her phone. She looked up when I walked in, her expression unreadable. You've been gone a lot lately, she said, her tone neutral. Work, I replied curtly. She arched an eyebrow. Funny. I thought you said you were taking a step back. I ignored her and headed for the stairs. I wasn't in the mood for another round of her moral gymnastics. But her voice stopped me halfway up. John. I turned, my hand gripping the banister. What? She hesitated, her fingers playing with the edge of her sleeve. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of guilt in her eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Is this it? She asked quietly. Is this how we end? I stared at her, my chest tight with a mix of anger and sadness I couldn't untangle. We ended the moment you chose him. Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. I turned and climbed the stairs, leaving her in the shadows of the living room. In the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the dark window. Destroy them. The words had become a mantra, a steady drumbeat driving me forward. I didn't know what kind of man I'd be when this was over, but I knew one thing for certain. By the time I was done, none of them would ever forget my name. The air in the office was suffocating, a stale mix of recycled air and desperation. Daniel Price sat across from me, his legs crossed, one hand casually resting on the arm of the chair. He wore that same smug expression I'd come to hate, his grin as easy as if we were just two old friends catching up over drinks. John, come on, he said, leaning forward slightly. You've been tense lately. Let's clear the air. What's going on? I studied him, my fingers steepled under my chin, forcing myself to remain calm. The urge to lunge across the desk and beat the smirk off his face was almost overwhelming. But not yet. Not here. I needed him to feel safe, to believe he still held the upper hand. Clear the air. I echoed, keeping my voice measured. All right, Daniel. Let's do that. I slid the file across the desk toward him. He glanced at it, his brow furrowing slightly, but the smirk stayed. He opened it, his eyes scanning the first few pages of bank statements, the screenshots of wire transfers. The smirk faltered. What is this? He asked, his tone shifting. A hint of nervousness crept in, though he tried to hide it. You tell me, I said. Millions siphoned out of this company, hidden behind shell corporations, funneled into accounts tied to Ethan Grant. Your name, your signature, your handiwork. His eyes snapped up to mine, and for the first time, I saw it. Fear. John, I don't know what this is, but it's not what it looks like, he stammered. This has to be some kind of mistake. I slammed my fist on the desk, the sharp sound echoing through the room. Don't you dare insult me, Daniel. Don't you sit there and lie to my face after everything you've done. He recoiled slightly, his composure slipping further. Look, I don't know where this came from, but I swear to God. Shut up, I growled, cutting him off. Do you know how long I trusted you? How many years I let you sit in this office in this chair, and pretend to have my back while you stabbed me in it? Daniel's jaw tightened, his hands clenching around the edges of the file. John, you don't understand. Don't I? I stood, leaning over the desk, towering over him. I understand perfectly. You're a parasite. You latched onto me, onto my company, because you couldn't build anything on your own. And then you dragged Maggie into it. You poisoned everything I built. At the mention of Maggie, his face darkened. Don't bring her into this. I laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and humorless. Oh, she's already in it, Daniel. You made damn sure of that. He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't let him. You know what the worst part is? I said, my voice low and cold. It wasn't enough for you to steal from me. You had to take her too. My wife. My family. John. Shut up. I slammed my hand down again, my voice rising. You're going to tell me everything. Every account, every contact, every name. Because if you don't, I swear to God, I'll make sure you go down for all of it. He stared at me, his face pale, his composure shattered. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the office's HVAC system. Then he leaned back in his chair, his hands falling to his lap. You think you're the hero here, don't you? He said, his voice quiet but sharp. You think you're some righteous avenger, cleaning up the mess I made. But you're not. You're just a bitter, broken man who let his own life fall apart. My jaw tightened, but I said nothing. You neglected her, John. For years. You buried yourself in this company and left her to rot. So don't sit there and act like I'm the only one who betrayed you. You betrayed her long before I did. The words hit like a gut punch, but I didn't flinch. I couldn't. You done? I asked, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. He smirked again, though it didn't reach his eyes. Yeah, I'm done. Good. I straightened, smoothing the front of my jacket. Because now it's my turn. Before he could respond, the door opened, and two men in dark suits stepped inside. Federal agents, their badges clipped to their belts. Daniel's head whipped around, his face going pale. Daniel Price, one of the agents said, his voice firm. You're under arrest for embezzlement, corporate fraud, and conspiracy. What? Daniel shot out of his chair, his hands raised. No, this is a mistake. The agents moved quickly, cuffing him and reading him his rights as he sputtered protests. I watched in silence, my arms crossed over my chest, my expression blank. As they led him toward the door, he turned back to me, his eyes wide with panic. John, please. Don't do this. We can fix this. You and me, like old times. I met his gaze, my voice cold and even. There are no old times, Daniel. Not anymore. They dragged him out, his protests echoing down the hall. I sank back into my chair, the weight of what had just happened settling over me. The first piece had fallen. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. When I got home, Maggie was waiting for me in the living room, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. What did you do? She asked, her voice low and sharp. I dropped my keys on the counter and turned to face her. What I had to. Her eyes narrowed. I saw the news. Daniel's been arrested. You set him up, didn't you? I took a step closer, my gaze locked on hers. I didn't set him up, Maggie. He did that all on his own. She shook her head, her voice rising. You're destroying everything, John. You think this is going to make you feel better? You think tearing him down is going to fix what's broken between us? What's broken between us is you, I said, my voice hard. You chose him. You chose to betray me, to destroy our family. And now, you get to live with the consequences. She flinched, but she didn't back down. And what about Caleb? What about Grace? What happens to them when you burn everything to the ground? I stared at her, my chest heaving. They'll be fine. Because, unlike you, I'll make sure they're taken care of. Her lip curled and for a moment, she looked like she was going to lash out. But then she turned and stormed upstairs, leaving me alone in the darkened room. I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands. The silence pressed in around me, heavy and suffocating. I'd won the first battle, but it felt hollow. Empty. Because deep down, I knew Maggie was right about one thing. This wasn't going to fix anything. But it sure as hell wasn't going to stop me. The glow from the living room fireplace flickered across the glass of whiskey in my hand. I sat there in the silence, the house around me feeling like a mausoleum. The space I'd built for a family that didn't really exist. I told myself I should sleep, but the adrenaline of the day wouldn't let me rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel's face, smirking, then pleading as the agents dragged him away. I should have felt satisfaction, triumph even. But instead, all I felt was exhaustion. The kind that settled deep in your bones and didn't leave. Upstairs, Maggie's door slammed shut, followed by the sound of muffled crying. It wasn't the first time I'd heard her cry behind that door, but it hit differently tonight. Maybe because I wasn't sure if the tears were for Daniel or for what she thought we'd lost. Did it even matter? My phone buzzed on the coffee table. I grabbed it without much thought, expecting Alex. Instead, the screen lit up with a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated before answering. "Kane," I said, my voice rough. "John, it's Ethan Grant." His voice sent a wave of cold fury coursing through me. I sat up straighter, gripping the phone tighter. "You've got some nerve." "Save the righteous anger," he said, his tone sharp. "I didn't call to fight. I called because I think we have something to talk about." "You think we have something to talk about?" I spat. "You've been feeding off my company for years. Using my people to gut me from the inside out. And you've been dismantling my network like a damn sledgehammer," he shot back. "Look, I'm not calling to trade insults. I'm calling because this thing between us? It's about to get a lot worse if you don't back off." A cold smile spread across my face. "Worse for you, maybe." "You think you're untouchable, Kane? You think Daniel was my only play? You have no idea how deep this goes. How many people you're about to piss off. Is that a threat?" I asked, my voice low and dangerous. "It's a fact," he replied, his voice just as sharp. "You're poking a hornet's nest, John. And trust me, you're not ready for what's inside." I leaned back on the couch, staring at the ceiling. "You sound nervous, Ethan. I didn't think I'd ever hear you sweat." "Don't mistake my warning for weakness," he said. "You think you've won because you took out Daniel? He was a pawn. A useful one, sure, but expendable. The people I'm working with? They're bigger than you. Bigger than Kane Enterprises." "Then they'll fall harder," I said coldly. "One by one." There was silence on the other end of the line, heavy and tense. Then, Ethan laughed, the sound bitter and humorless. "You really don't get it, do you? This isn't just business, John. This is war. And when this is over, you won't have anything left." The line went dead before I could respond. I stared at the phone in my hand, his words echoing in my mind. War. The anger simmering in my chest hardened into something colder, sharper. If Ethan thought he could scare me, he'd miscalculated. I wasn't the same man I'd been a week ago, a month ago. I wasn't a man who sat back and let the world chip away at him piece by piece. I stood, grabbing my jacket from the back of the couch. If Ethan wanted war, I'd give it to him. Alex's office was dimly lit, the blinds drawn tight against the city lights outside. He was sitting at his desk, flipping through a thick stack of papers when I walked in. He looked up, his expression dark. "Late night," he said, leaning back in his chair. "It's about to get later," I replied, dropping into the chair across from him. "What happened?" "Ethan Grant called me." Alex raised an eyebrow. "And he thinks he can scare me into backing off." A slow smile spread across Alex's face, more predator than friend. "He's desperate." "That's good." I shook my head. "No, it's not. He's got more cards to play, and we're running out of time." Alex tossed the papers onto the desk, and steepled his fingers. So, what do you want to do? I want everything on him. Every deal, every partner, every skeleton in his closet. I don't care what it takes or how much it costs. I want him ruined. Alex nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. All right. But you need to understand something, John. When you go this far, there's no going back. You're not just taking down a rival. You're taking down his empire. That means bodies. Collateral damage. I don't care, I said, my voice firm. He came after my company, my family. He thinks he can scare me? He has no idea who he's dealing with. Alex studied me for a long moment before nodding. All right. I'll make the calls. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. And Alex? Yeah. Make sure Maggie knows where her loyalties lie. If she's still in contact with him, I want to know. His smile widened, sharp and knowing. Consider it done. When I got home, the house was dark. I climbed the stairs quietly, pausing outside Maggie's door. The light was still on, a thin glow spilling under the crack. I stood there for a moment, listening. I could hear her voice, soft and hushed. A phone call. I pushed the door open without knocking. She was sitting on the bed, her phone pressed to her ear, her eyes wide with surprise. John, what are you? Who are you talking to? I asked, my voice calm but ice cold. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the phone. It's none of your business. I stepped closer, my gaze never leaving hers. It's my house. It's my business. She glared at me, defiance flashing in her eyes. It was Grace. I was checking on her. I stared at her for a long moment, my chest tightening with suspicion. Slowly, I extended my hand. Give me the phone. John, this is ridiculous. Give me the goddamn phone, Maggie. Her jaw tightened, but she handed it over, her movements stiff. I checked the call log, my stomach twisting when I saw the name. Ethan Grant. My hand clenched around the phone, my pulse pounding in my ears. You're still talking to him? John, I don't. My voice was a growl, low and dangerous. Don't you dare lie to me again. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't care. I threw the phone onto the bed and turned toward the door. John, please, she called after me. It's not what you think. I stopped, my hand on the doorknob, and turned to face her. Then what is it, Maggie? Because right now, all I see is someone who doesn't know how to stop digging her own grave. She opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't wait to hear it. I walked out, slamming the door behind me. War. Ethan had called it war. He was right. And I wasn't planning to lose. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The phone call with Ethan, the confrontation with Maggie, the seething rage that wouldn't leave my chest, it all boiled together into something sharp and unrelenting. I sat in the darkened living room, staring at the dying embers in the fireplace, gripping a glass of whiskey that I hadn't touched in hours. Maggie's voice still echoed in my head, her pleas, her excuses. It's not what you think. She was right in a way. It wasn't what I thought. It was worse. Every word she'd said, every tear she'd cried, was just another move in her game, another lie to keep her secrets buried. I wasn't letting her bury anything anymore. By dawn, I had a plan. A brutal, unforgiving plan that would tear through the lives of everyone who had crossed me. Maggie, Daniel, Ethan, they'd built their house of cards on my back. Now I was going to burn it to the ground. Alex met me at a coffee shop downtown, a quiet little hole in the wall that didn't attract much attention. He looked more ragged than usual, dark circles under his eyes. His clothes rumpled like he hadn't slept either. He slid a USB drive across the table as he sat down, his expression grim. This is everything, he said. Every deal Ethan's made with your people. Every bribe, every kickback, every shady transfer. I picked up the drive, turning it over in my hand. How bad is it? Alex snorted. Bad enough to bury him. This isn't just corporate sabotage, John. He's got ties to illegal trade, insider deals, maybe even blackmail. If the feds get a hold of this, they'll gut him. A cold smile spread across my face. Good. Alex leaned back in his chair, studying me. But it's not just Ethan. Your wife's fingerprints are all over this too. Emails, text messages, meetings. She wasn't just complicit, John. She was part of the machine. I tightened my grip on the USB, my knuckles white. I expected that. He hesitated, his gaze searching mine. What are you going to do? I set the drive down and took a slow sip of coffee, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue. I'm going to make them regret every goddamn decision they've ever made. The first strike came that afternoon. Alex's contact, Dean, had found a vulnerability in Grant Innovation's internal servers, an unpatched backdoor that Ethan's team hadn't noticed. Within hours, we had access to their entire database. Contracts, financial records, internal communications, it was all there, laid bare. Alex grinned as he clicked through the files on his laptop, his fingers flying over the keyboard. You want to hit him where it hurts? This is it. We can leak these files to the press, hand them over to the feds, or just sit back and watch the fallout. All of it, I said, my voice cold and steady. Everything. But start with the press. I want the world to know who Ethan Grant really is. Within hours, the headlines started rolling in. Corporate giant Ethan Grant under investigation for fraud. Exclusive. Leaked documents tie Grant Innovations to bribery scandal. The media frenzy was immediate. Reporters swarming Grant's offices, investors pulling out, board members demanding answers. I sat back in my office, watching the chaos unfold on the news, my satisfaction tempered by the storm still raging inside me. Ethan's empire was crumbling, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. That evening, I confronted Maggie again. She was in the kitchen, cooking dinner like nothing had happened. The smell of garlic and rosemary filled the air, but it turned my stomach. I leaned against the doorway, watching her for a moment before speaking. How long have you been working with him? She froze, her hand tightening around the spatula. Slowly, she turned to face me, her expression carefully blank. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't, I said sharply. Don't lie to me. I've seen the emails, Maggie. The meetings. The phone calls. How long? Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes hard. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Then what was it supposed to be? I demanded, stepping closer. You helped him gut my company. You sold me out, Maggie. For what? Money? Power? Him. Her composure cracked, her voice trembling with anger and something that almost sounded like guilt. You think this was about him? About money? It was about you, John. About the man you became. The man who forgot how to be a husband. A father. A goddamn human being. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. You don't get to play the victim here. Not after what you've done. Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice stayed strong. And what about what you've done? You think I don't know about your plans? About how you're tearing down Ethan, Daniel, everyone? You're not a victim, John. You're a monster. I stepped closer, towering over her. And whose fault is that, Maggie? Who made me this way? She didn't answer. She couldn't. I turned and walked out, her choked sobs following me down the hall. By the end of the week, the dominoes were falling faster than I'd anticipated. Ethan's company was in freefall, his board of directors calling for his resignation. Daniel, still in custody, had been cut loose by Ethan's lawyers, left to fend for himself. And Maggie, she was unraveling before my eyes, her defiance giving way to desperation. I found her in the living room one night, staring blankly at the TV, a half-empty glass of wine in her hand. She didn't look at me when I walked in. I want a divorce, she said quietly. I stopped, my chest tightening. You don't get to walk away from this, Maggie. Not after everything. She turned to face me, her eyes tired but resolute. There's nothing left, John. Nothing worth saving. I took a step closer, my voice low and dangerous. You're wrong. There's plenty left. And I'm going to take all of it. Her lip trembled, but she didn't respond. She just turned back to the TV, shutting me out completely. As I stood there, staring at the woman I'd once loved, I realized something. This wasn't about saving anything anymore. It wasn't about rebuilding, or healing, or even justice. It was about destruction. And I wasn't stopping until there was nothing left of them. The morning after Maggie's declaration, the house felt heavier than ever. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, a crushing reminder of how far we'd fallen. I walked through the rooms like a ghost, every corner holding echoes of a life that had been nothing but a mirage. I found myself in Caleb's room, the door half open, the faint smell of teenage boy lingering in the air. His bed was unmade, his basketball jersey tossed over a chair, his desk cluttered with homework and a half-empty bottle of Gatorade. He wasn't home, off at a friend's house, probably trying to escape the tension that had been suffocating all of us. I sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the pile of textbooks on the desk. Math, history, science, all the things he'd been working on while I'd been too distracted to notice. Too focused on the company. Too blind to see what was happening right under my nose. My phone buzzed in my pocket, jolting me back to reality. I pulled it out and saw Alex's name on the screen. "Talk," I said, my voice rough. "Grant's circling the drain," Alex said. "The board's cutting ties, his investors are fleeing, and the feds are sniffing around his finances. You did it, John. He's done." The satisfaction I expected didn't come. Instead, I felt a dull, empty ache, like a part of me had been carved out and left to rot. "And Daniel?" I asked. "Still holding out," Alex replied. "He hasn't flipped yet, but it's only a matter of time. The evidence we handed over is airtight. He knows he's screwed." I nodded to myself, my grip tightening on the phone. "And Maggie?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "She's unraveling," Alex said carefully. "She's not talking to Ethan anymore, not that it matters. His ship's sinking, and she knows it. But she's still fighting you, John. She doesn't want to give up the divorce." "She doesn't get a choice," I said coldly. "Not after what she's done." Alex hesitated again. "You sure about that?" Sometimes it's better to cut your losses." "My losses," I said sharply, "are her fault. And I'm not cutting anything until I've taken back what's mine." That afternoon, I went to see Maggie's lawyer. Her office was in a sleek high-rise downtown, all glass walls and polished floors, the kind of place that screamed money and power. The receptionist led me to a conference room, where Maggie's lawyer, Christine Palmer, was already waiting. Christine was sharp, no nonsense, the kind of woman who didn't waste time on pleasantries. She stood as I entered, offering a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Kane," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Thank you for meeting me." I sat, my posture stiff. "Let's get this over with." She nodded, sliding a folder across the table. "Maggie has made her position clear. She's requesting an amicable divorce, with joint custody of Caleb and Grace, and an equitable division of assets." I opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. My jaw tightened as I read the terms that favored her far more than they did me. "This isn't equitable," I said, my voice low and cold. "This is extortion." Christine's smile didn't waver. "Maggie is willing to negotiate, of course. But given the circumstances," I cut in, "she's lucky I'm not suing her for fraud, conspiracy, and emotional damages." Christine's composure cracked slightly, her brows furrowing. "Mr. Kane, I don't think—" "You don't think, or you don't know?" I leaned forward, my voice sharp. "Because what you don't know, Ms. Palmer, is that I have enough evidence to bury Maggie in so much legal trouble she'll spend the next decade digging herself out." Her lips parted, but no words came out. I continued, my tone like ice. "Emails, phone records, financial transactions. I have it all. And if you think for 1 second I'm going to roll over and let her walk away with half of what I've built, you're as delusional as she is." Christine straightened, her professional mask snapping back into place. "Mr. Kane, this isn't about rolling over. This is about finding a resolution that—" "The resolution," I said, cutting her off again, is that Maggie walks away with nothing. No money, no property, no custody. She made her bed, and now she can lie in it. Her eyes narrowed. You think a judge will side with you? After everything? I smiled, cold and humorless. I don't need a judge, Miss Palmer. I just need the truth. And trust me, I have plenty of that. When I got home, Maggie was waiting for me in the foyer, her arms crossed, her expression tight. You went to see Christine, she said flatly. I did, I replied, tossing my keys onto the table. Her jaw tightened. What the hell is wrong with you, John? Why can't you just let this go? I stepped closer, towering over her. Because you don't get to ruin my life and walk away with a smile on your face. She flinched, but she didn't back down. I didn't ruin your life. You did that all on your own. The words hit like a slap, but I didn't show it. Instead, I leaned in closer, my voice low and dangerous. You think this is over, Maggie? It's not. Not until I've taken everything from you. Her eyes glistened with tears, but she refused to look away. And then what, John? What's left after you've burned it all to the ground? I stared at her, my chest heaving, my hands trembling with the force of holding back everything I wanted to say. Finally, I stepped back, my voice barely above a whisper. You'll find out. I turned and walked away, her choked sobs echoing behind me. The next day, Alex called with an update. Ethan was officially out, removed from his own company by a unanimous board vote. Daniel, too, had folded, agreeing to cooperate with the feds in exchange for a reduced sentence. I sat in my office, staring out at the city below as Alex spoke. His words were just noise, background static to the storm in my mind. John, he said finally. You there? Yeah, I said, my voice distant. I'm here. You did it, man, he said. You won. I closed my eyes, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I'd won. I'd destroyed them. I'd taken back everything they tried to steal. So why did it feel like I'd lost? I spent the next week watching the fallout from my office, perched high above the chaos like a vulture circling its prey. The news was relentless. Ethan Grant's empire collapsing under the weight of its scandals, Daniel Price's plea deal making headlines, Maggie's name surfacing in speculative gossip pieces. The public loved a good downfall, and I'd given them the spectacle of a lifetime. But as satisfying as it should have been, it left me hollow. Maggie barely left the house. The confidence, the defiance that had defined her, was gone. I'd catch her sitting in the living room, staring blankly at nothing, her wine untouched on the coffee table. Sometimes she'd cry, quietly, when she thought I wasn't around. And sometimes, I wondered if the victory was worth it. I came home late one night, the house dark and silent. The faint glow of the fireplace flickered in the living room, and I found Maggie sitting there, her knees pulled to her chest, her face pale and drawn. She didn't look up when I entered, didn't acknowledge me at all. You've made your point, John, she said softly, her voice barely audible. You've won. So why are you still here? I stood in the doorway, my chest tight, my fists clenched at my sides. This is my house, Maggie. Her laugh was bitter, hollow. Your house. Your company. Your life. God forbid anyone else have a piece of it. I stepped closer, the anger flaring in my chest. Don't you dare try to turn this around on me. Not after everything you've done. She looked up then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. And what have you done, John? Have you stopped to think about that? About what this is doing to Caleb? To Grace? To me? This isn't about you, I snapped. It's about what you and Daniel and Ethan tried to take from me. She shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. We didn't take anything from you, John. You gave it away. You gave it all away the moment you decided this, your empire, was more important than your family. I flinched, her words hitting harder than I wanted to admit. But I didn't let it show. I couldn't. You're drunk, I said, my voice cold. Go to bed. She stared at me for a long moment before standing, her movements slow and heavy. You've already burned everything down, John. What else is there left to destroy? She walked past me, her shoulder brushing mine as she headed upstairs. I stood there in the dark, her words hanging in the air like smoke. The next morning, I sat in Caleb's room again, the emptiness pressing down on me. His things were still scattered around, untouched since the last time I'd been there. A basketball sat in the corner, scuffed and worn, a reminder of all the games I'd missed. His school photos lined the dresser, each one showing a boy growing into someone I barely recognized. The door creaked open behind me, and I turned to see Caleb standing there, his expression guarded. "Hey," he said quietly. "Hey," I replied, my voice rough. He stepped into the room, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I heard about Daniel. And, Mom." I nodded, unsure what to say. "I don't get it," he said, his voice cracking. "Why did you do it? Why did you have to destroy everything?" I flinched, his words cutting deeper than they should have. "I didn't destroy anything, Caleb. I protected what's mine." He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "No, you didn't. You just tore everything apart." I stood, the anger bubbling to the surface. "Your mother did that. Daniel did that. Ethan did that. I'm just cleaning up the mess." He stepped back, his eyes hard. "You don't get it, do you? You think this is about you, about your company, but it's not. It's about us. Your family. And you've ruined it." "Caleb," I started, but he cut me off. "Grace cries herself to sleep every night. Mom barely eats. And you're not even the same person anymore." His voice broke, the tears spilling over. "I don't even know who you are." I stood there frozen, as he turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the house, a final, shattering blow. I stayed in my office for the rest of the day, staring out at the city as the sun set and the lights came on, one by one. I'd won. I'd destroyed Ethan, taken back my company, exposed Daniel, and left Maggie with nothing. I'd gotten everything I wanted. So why did it feel like I'd lost everything? Alex called late that evening, his voice carrying the usual edge of cynicism. "You did it, John. Ethan's done. The feds are swarming his offices, his board's cutting him loose, and his reputation's shot. He won't recover from this." "Good," I said, my voice flat. "You don't sound like someone who just won the biggest fight of his life." I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. "Maybe because it doesn't feel like I've won anything." Alex was silent for a moment before sighing. "Look, John, I've known you a long time. And yeah, you've always been a bastard when you needed to be. But this isn't you." "Maybe it is," I said quietly. "No, it's not. You're not the guy who tears everything down just to prove a point. You're the guy who builds, who fights for what matters." I closed my eyes, Alex's words hitting harder than I wanted to admit. "And what if I don't know what matters anymore?" "Then figure it out," he said. "Before there's nothing left to save." He hung up, leaving me alone in the dark. Later that night, I found myself in the living room again, staring at the dying embers of the fire. Maggie sat across from me, her eyes hollow, her glass of wine untouched. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. "Was it worth it?" I looked at her, my chest tightening. "What?" "Everything," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Was it worth it?" I stared at her, the answer caught in my throat. For the first time, I didn't know what to say. The question lingered between us, heavy and suffocating. Maggie's face was pale, drawn, her eyes glistening but dry. She wasn't crying. She hadn't cried in front of me since this whole thing started, and I wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. "Was it worth it?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything you've done. Everyone you've hurt. Does it feel like winning?" I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, my hands clasped tightly together. I didn't look at her. I couldn't. "It wasn't about winning. Then what was it about, John?" Her voice cracked, the first sign of real emotion I'd seen from her in weeks. "Was it about making me pay? About proving you were the better man? Because all you've done is destroy us." Don't pretend this is my fault, I said sharply, finally looking at her. You started this, Maggie. You and Daniel and Ethan. You're the ones who betrayed me. Her lips trembled, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out. But instead she laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that cut deeper than any words. You still don't get it, do you? This was never about you, John. This was about what you let happen. What you let us become. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. I didn't let anything happen. I built this family. I built this life for us. And you're the one who threw it away. She stood too, facing me, her eyes blazing. You built a life for yourself, John. Not for us. You locked yourself in your office, buried yourself in your work, and left the rest of us behind. I was drowning, and you didn't even notice. Don't you dare try to justify what you did, I said, my voice low and dangerous. You cheated on me. You lied to me. You betrayed me. And now you want me to feel sorry for you. I don't want your pity, she snapped. I just want you to understand. But you're so goddamned blinded by your anger that you can't see anything else. Because anger is all I have left. I shouted, the words ripping from my throat before I could stop them. Do you know what it feels like to have everything you thought you knew ripped away? To find out that the people you trusted most are the ones who've been stabbing you in the back. Her face softened then, the fire in her eyes dimming. Yes, John. I do. Because I've been living that for years. The silence that followed was deafening. I stared at her, my chest heaving, my fists clenched at my sides. Her words echoed in my head, over and over, until I couldn't tell if they were hers or mine. I don't know how we got here, she said finally, her voice trembling. I don't know how we became these people. But I can't do this anymore. I can't keep fighting you. I turned away, staring out the window at the darkened street below. I wanted to yell at her, to blame her, to make her hurt the way I was hurting. But I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew she was right. We'd both let this happen. We'd both turned into people we didn't recognize. I don't know who I am anymore, I admitted, my voice barely audible. She stepped closer, her hand brushing my arm. It was the first time she'd touched me in weeks, and it sent a jolt through me, like a dying ember flaring back to life. You're John Kane, she said softly. The man who built an empire. The man who fought for what he believed in. But somewhere along the way, you forgot what you were fighting for. I closed my eyes, her words hitting harder than any accusation or insult. She was right. I'd spent so much time trying to destroy the people who'd hurt me that I hadn't stopped to think about what I was really fighting for. Or if it was even worth fighting for at all. What now? I asked, my voice raw. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was quiet, almost sad. Now we figure out who we want to be. And if that means walking away, then so be it. I turned to face her, my chest tightening at the sight of her. So small, so fragile, yet still so defiant. I didn't know if I loved her anymore. I didn't know if I hated her. All I knew was that the woman standing in front of me was the only person who truly knew me, and the thought of losing her felt like another betrayal. But maybe it was what we both needed. I don't want to lose Caleb and Grace, I said finally. You won't, she said, her voice steady. But if we keep going like this, we'll lose them anyway. I nodded, swallowing hard. I'll call the lawyer tomorrow. We'll figure out the terms. She blinked, surprised, but didn't argue. Instead, she just nodded, her shoulders sagging as if a weight had been lifted. As I watched her walk upstairs, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. And it wasn't peace. But it was something, an ember in the ashes, faint but still burning. The months that followed were quiet, almost eerie in their normalcy. The divorce was finalized without fanfare, and Maggie moved into a small house a few miles away. Caleb and Grace split their time between us, their laughter and warmth a balm to the wounds that still hadn't fully healed. Ethan Grant disappeared from the public eye, his empire shattered beyond repair. Daniel Price's name became synonymous with betrayal, his plea deal earning him a reduced sentence but no redemption. And I, John Kane, picked up the pieces of my life and started over. It wasn't easy. Some days, the anger still threatened to consume me, the memories of what I'd lost gnawing at the edges of my mind. But other days, I saw glimpses of the man I used to be, the man Maggie had fallen in love with, the man Caleb and Grace still needed me to be. And that was enough. For now it was enough. Because even in the darkest moments, the embers of something better still burned.